chapter. The great Imam, rahimahullah ta'ala, is looking at the chapter entitled al-Uzla. Al-Uzla is the Arabic word for spiritual seclusion. There's a related word which is khulwa. Khulwa is isolation. They're very similar, and in some cases they can serve as synonyms. However, when we get into the particulars of the two, there are scholars of the past that have distinguished uzla, spiritual seclusion, from khulwa, which is social isolation. So to give you some context as to what we're looking at right now, while we, and they say khulwa is widespread. There are many people that isolate themselves socially. And then there are very few people that isolate themselves or seclude themselves for spiritual purposes. So remember that, uzla and khulwa, and the difference between the two. So the uzla here is basically secluding oneself from personal desires from the nafs and whatever the nafs is calling you to do, and whatever it will however it will distract you from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whereas the khulwa, the differences or the nuance here is that this is simply just being by yourself and not taking it to the next level. This is just, if you were to say the khulwa would be the lower level of the physical mechanics of being alone, whereas the uzla is like the spiritual dimension of isolating yourself from the distractions of society, isolating yourself from people so that you're not harming them or unable to control yourself and your sins, etc. So he says that the people have differed in regards to their opinion of uzla or al-mukhalata, and that is, mukhalata is the opposite of uzla, which would be fellowship or community life. So basically he's saying that the scholars of our tradition have differed in regards to the two as to which one is more preferable and more virtuous. Even though each one of these, al-uzla and al-mukhalata, both the spiritual seclusion and communal life or fellowship, brotherhood or fraternity, sorority, etc., in the frame of the tradition, they both have sets of benefits and also catastrophes or harms that come with them. There's nothing that's perfect, right? There's nothing perfect about either of these. Both of them have their benefits and their challenges. And he says here that most of the ascetics, they have chosen al-uzla over fellowship. They've chosen to be alone and secluded themselves over wanting to mix with people and have to deal with social settings. And the people that have chosen this, he mentions a number of them. Sufyan al-Thawri, rahimahullah. These are great imams from the early generations, from the tabi'een, and a little bit after that. Sufyan al-Thawri was a great imam. Ibrahim ibn Adham, this was like one of the imams of asceticism in Islam. Some people refer to that as tazkiyah, some people refer to that as Sufism or tasawwuf. Either one, it's just really at some point semantics. But basically the intent is the same. Dawood al-Ta'i, and also he mentions al-Fudayl and Bishr al-Hafi, who is known as Bishr the Barefoot, as well as a number of other people that have been, supportive of al-uzla being the preferred type of lifestyle to live. If you're interested, I would definitely say this is a great homework assignment. This would be like a secondary assignment to look up some of these personalities: Sufyan al-Thawri, Ibrahim ibn Adham, Dawood al-Ta'i, and al-Fudayl, along with Bishr the Barefoot. I've mentioned some stories about some of these great imams in the past, and certainly there's a lot that can be learned from their biographies. On the other side of the spectrum, al-mukhalata, which is fellowship, there are from the great imams of the past, Sa'id ibn Musayyib, al-Shurayh. These are from the early generations as well, from the tabi'een. Al-Sha'bi, who was Amir ibn Sharahil. Al-Sha'bi, he was a tabi'i, he was a great scholar of hadith and faqih. And also Ibn al-Mubarak. Ibn al-Mubarak was known as Amir al-Mu'mineen fil hadith. So these names were also great imams in and of themselves who preferred al-mukhalata. So here you can see the differing opinions as to which one is preferable over the other, which means that, there is some fadl, there is some virtue to both. If you're trying to make mufadala, which one is better, there's obviously good in both. If there was no good, one was just absolutely garbage, then you wouldn't need to be arguing about this particular topic. So that's important to keep in mind. He basically says that both these camps, they have their evidence and their proofs that they use in order to substantiate their positions. And we're going to talk about some of that right now. That's the introduction of this particular chapter. The first group, which are pro-uzla, pro-seclusion, they mention a number of hadith and statements from the companions, etc. And the first one we're going to look at is in Sahih Bukhari and Muslim. And this is the hadith reported by Abu Sa'id al-Khudri radiyallahu anhu. It was said to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which people are better? And so he sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says, رَجُلٌ يُجَاهِدُ بِنَفْسِهِ وَمَالِهِ وَرَجُلٌ فِي شِعْبٍ مِنَ الشِّعَابِ يَعْبُدُ رَبَّهُ وَيَدَعُ النَّاسَ مِنْ شَرِّهِ. He says here, someone who struggles and strives with their life and their wealth, and a man who basically takes to the mountain gorges, worshiping his Lord and sparing people from his own evil. Someone that isolates themselves. They seclude themselves. In worship, this is key. And this is what's going to distinguish our current seclusion and isolation from being khulwa, which would be just the mechanical part, to being uzla, the spiritual aspect of it. What is it? My question to you, is it that we will be doing in these days to come while many of us are at home? What is it that we're going to be doing? Are we going to be participating and practicing in a spiritual exercise? Or is it, which could be very fruitful, which could be very delightful, which could be very beneficial? Or are we going to be participating in a kind of a self-imposed physical imprisonment, and we will be stressed, filled with anxiety, worried, overwhelmed, many of us, especially the extroverts out there who just are just into fellowship and community life and love to mix and mingle and just, you have to get your fix in. I know the introverts out there are just loving this, and they're fine with everything. They probably didn't change much of their life before this social distancing. They haven't changed much. But for the majority of people, we are changing our habits and we are doing things very differently. So we have an opportunity, is basically what I'm getting at. And this hadith, been reported in Sahih Bukhari and Muslim, indicates that very thing. The next hadith, Uqba ibn Amr radiyallahu anhu, he says, قُلْتُ يَا رَسُولُ اللَّهِ مَنْ نَجَاتُ. He says, O Messenger of Allah, what is salvation? What will be our salvation? And the Prophet ﷺ, he says, إِمْلِكْ عَلَيْكَ لِسَانَكَ. He says, basically, safeguard your tongue. Watch what you say. He says, watch what you say. وَلْيَسَعَكْ بَيْتُكَ وَابْكِ عَلَى خَطِيئَتِكَ. Basically, here he means that you should be busy with your home. In another wording, he says, إِلْزَمْ بَيْتَكَ, which basically means stay at home. So there's multiple narrations of the same hadith. And this hadith was reported by Imam Ahmad rahimahullah ta'ala, as well as found in the collection of Imam at-Tirmidhi. So you can find various different wordings here. So the first one, he says, فَلْيَسَعَكْ بَيْتَكَ فَلْيَسَعَكْ بَيْتُكَ وَابْكِ عَلَى خَطِيئَتِكَ, basically meaning to stay in your homes and weep over your sins. Weep over your sins. And if you were with me last night, in our previous broadcast, you would know that we were talking about our role in all of this as human beings, as people of moral capacity, that whatever we do, it's basically going to yield what we have to deal with. We will be responsible for our actions. And so now it's time to sit back and reflect and maybe even shed some tears for the mistakes, the misdeeds, the misgivings that we've made in order to come out of this better. Here's one of the great companions of the Prophet ﷺ, named Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu. Many of you are familiar with him, of course, al-Faruq. He said, خُذُوا بِحَظِّكُم مِّنَ الْعُزْلَةِ. Basically like, everyone needs to participate in uzla from time to time. Everyone needs to seclude themselves for spiritual purposes from time to time. This is important because Umar ibn Khattab gives us some perspective. And he was, of course, one of the rightly guided predecessors of the Prophet ﷺ. And so this is golden advice that though it may not be a regular habit that we can handle, something that we can do on a continuous basis, and there are people that have. Some of the names that I mentioned, there are people that have, and there are people that do, but it is a minority of people that are able to sustain this level of isolation and seclusion. However, each and every one of us should be looking to make this a part of our routine, like our annual routine. And some of us do that during i'tikaf. You would recognize this if you were a regular person of i'tikaf, that you go to the masjid for a day or two or 10 or whatever period of time. As we know, i'tikaf is kind of lenient, but especially the last 10 days, it can be real uzla, especially if you're in a place where, the community is not large or the people that practice i'tikaf are very few in number. You'll find that you could be by yourself a lot of time, and it really your experience really depends on what you put into it. And so Umar ibn Khattab is encouraging us to practice al-uzla, of course that which is beneficial to us. The next, Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas radiallahu anhu, he says, لو وددت أن بيني وبين الناس بابا من حديد لا يكلمني أحد ولا أكلمه حتى ألقى الله سبحانه. Basically he says, I wish that between me and the rest of people was a door of iron. No one would talk to me and I would not talk to anyone until I met Allah. Another narration here from Ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu, these are the companions. He says, kunu yunabi al-ilm. He says, be fountains, I don't have my reading glasses. Be fountains of knowledge, masabih al-layl, lanterns of the night. Okay, so fountains of knowledge, obviously we understand that. That you are a student of knowledge, a person that learns and teaches, disseminates the sciences of our tradition because of the benefit, and that's also a type of sadaqah jariyah, that if you can produce something of knowledge that it will continue to be beneficial for you. Also, masabih al-layl is the lanterns of night. That basically means enliven the night with prayer and with worship. He says ahlas al-bayut, and this is where the point is. Ahlas al-bayut. Ahlas here is it's the saddlecloth, if you will. The saddlecloth, there's like a cloth, if you've ever been into horseback riding or you've seen that. They put a cloth over the horse's back and then they put the saddle on top of it. Or there's it's kind of like a padding. It's a padding that is put on top of the horse's back and then the saddle on top of it. That ahlas, or that hils is the singular form. Hils can also be referred to as the padding like in your furnishing. Sometimes we put hils underneath our carpeting in our homes. But when you say hilsu baytihi, which is basically the padding of his home, it means someone that does not depart from their home. So the padding here, we're talking about the padding of the home, is a person that does not leave their house. And this is the point of this particular statement. He says, وَإِيَّاكُمْ وَمَجَالِسُ الْأَسْوَاقِ فَإِنَّهَا تُلْهِي وَتُلْغِي. And beware of, the gatherings of the marketplaces, for they distract you and they also cause you tulghi basically here is causing you to be involved in vain and idle talk. The next statement that we have here, which is in promotion of al-uzla, is from Dawood al-Ta'i. He says, "Firra min al-nasi kama tafirra min al-asad." He basically says to flee from mankind just like you would flee from a lion. The next one is Abu Muhalhil. He says here, then he's talking about a story from Sufyan al-Thawri. He says, Sufyan al-Thawri took me out to the cemetery and we basically isolated ourselves in a corner of the cemetery, and he began to cry. Okay, so they said they went to the, I mean, imagine doing this today. He went to the cemetery. He secluded himself and his companion Abu Muhalhil. Basically, he's teaching him something here, and he began to cry. And he says, "Ya Aba Muhalhil, in istata'ta an la tukhalita fi zamanika ahadan faf'al." If you're able to, during your time, if you're able to stay away from people, don't mix with people, then do so. Walakin hammuka, he says here, but your focus should be on self-reformation. Your focus should be on self-reformation. Now, I'm going to be real with you. And this is, I mean, I don't want to be dark and gloomy, but I want to be reflective in the moment. And we have a real moment of reflection and opportunity in that here, Sufyan al-Thawri goes to the graveyard with his companion, and they seclude themselves there. The graveyard, why would you be going there? I mean, think about it. You go to the graveyard in order to reflect. And that's what the Prophet ﷺ advised us to do. Go to the graveyard to reflect and to think about death. We're not at the graveyard, my dear brothers and sisters, but we are witnessing people suffer from this virus, and we're reminded of death a great deal. People in our communities are dying from this thing, especially our elders. And so this is very similar in that we can really take the lessons that this opportunity is providing us with, right? To be reflective and to remember death. And when we do that, we can begin to start focusing on self-reformation. Self-reformation. So that's kind of the introduction to those that have adopted the view that al-uzla or spiritual seclusion is preferable over fellowship, mukhalata. That gives us all of the evidences, or some of them, I should say, some of the strong supportive evidences for their position. Now let's quickly look over here, and this is a lot less to this, which should indicate where we kind of stand in terms of the presentation by the authors. These men were pious men, the authors and those that arranged the abridgments and summarizations. They were pious men, and there's something to be said about social or spiritual seclusion, and I'll make some concluding remarks as to what the ruling of this actually is, according to the majority. He says, as for what those who have chosen fellowship, what their position is, or their evidence, he says, the Prophet ﷺ, he says, al-mu'minu alladhi yukhalitu an-nasa wa yasbiru ala adahum khayrun min al-mu'min alladhi la yukhalituhum wa la yasbiru ala adahum. Basically, the believer who mixes with and engages with the people and is patient with the harm that he faces by doing so is better than the believer that does not mix or engage with them and is not patient with that harm. The Prophet ﷺ, he mixed with people. That was his way. That was the way of the prophets and messengers, was to mix with people, to engage people, to live a communal life of fellowship, to have fellowship with people. That's what he did. But he had to. The Prophet ﷺ, that was the life that he had to live in order to convey the message. And, as representatives, some of us that choose to represent Islam and to spread the teachings of the religion, we may have to also adopt this as at least, a part of our life. I mean, this is just how it is. We have to engage people. We have to be able to be patient, and that means a great deal of work has to be done on ourselves. We need to be able to equip ourselves with the tools that are necessary to engage people in particular our time when, sin is rampant, religion is on the decline, spirituality is become very watered down, and I'm not saying that in a judgmental way. I'm just saying that in a way that we can, just like something that I have observed in pop culture. So we're faced with a great deal. we have to be very, very patient, and that patience has to be patient with our own faith, being patiently observant in our faith in the face of, just almost the very opposite. So this is one of the strongest evidences that they use, and this hadith is reported by the great Imam Ahmad as well as Ibn Majah. Another, some other forms of supporting evidence, which the Imam says, everything else they use is kind of weak in nature, and it doesn't really establish an argument for their case. And one of those is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when he says, وَلَا تَكُونُوا كَالَّذِي تَفَرَّقُوا وَاخْتَلَفُوا. And do not be like those who have divided and differed. This is in Surah Al-Imran. Do not be like those who have divided and differed. He says this is very weak. This is kind of a weak argument. And because the intent or the meaning of this is not uzla, meaning to isolate or seclude yourself. But what's intended by this tafarruq, which is to be divided or to differ, is to differ in your viewpoint, to differ in your opinion and your position. The various different sects, if you will, and factions and schisms that you would find in regards to the fundamentals of our tradition. So we're prohibited from dividing in that regard. We have to all agree on the fundamentals of faith. We have to agree on our belief in Allah and His angels and His books and His messengers in the last day and the divine decree. We have to agree on the obligatory nature of the shahada, on salah, on zakat and fasting and hajj. Those are the basics of Islam. We're prohibited from disagreeing on those things. So it's not talking about, he's basically saying this verse is not talking about dividing, meaning everyone going off into their own mountain gorge or their own secluded areas to worship. No, that's not what it's referring to. Though they're trying to use this as an evidence to say, look, you can't divide, you got to stick together. Not only do you have to stick together in terms of your doctrine and in your understanding of faith, but you have to physically stay together. So it's kind of weak. Also, the hadith of Prophet ﷺ, he says, La hijrata fawqa thalat. There's no hijrah here is like boycotting above 3 days, beyond 3 days. You can't boycott one another. That's where you cut someone off. And it's permissible in Islam, if you're wronged or there, some pressing matter that's happened and you want to boycott somebody and you stay away from them for a number of days or you avoid them. And the Prophet ﷺ prohibited this beyond 3 days. He said, and the best of them are those that begin with the salam. He says, al-uzla is hajrun bil kulliyah. That's what they say. Hajrun bil kulliyah. They say, look, if you are a practitioner of al-uzla, you're not just boycotting people for 3 days. You're boycotting people completely. And again, the Imam here, he says, this is kind of a weak argument. Because what is intended by the hajr here, or the hijrah, which is the boycott, is that you're not going to talk to them, you're not going to say salam to them, and you're not going to interact with them in the normal way. And that's not what uzla is all about. It's not the intention is not to do that. The intention is not, look, I'm going to shun this person, I'm going to stay away from this person for a particular reason. No, you're just secluding yourself so that you aren't harming others, or you're not burdening them with your sinful ways. You're not burdening them with, all of your baggage, etc. And you are just devoting yourself to the worship of Allah. And that is where uzla differs here in many ways. Number one is that, you have to spend your day in righteousness. You have to spend your time in righteousness. And that, believe it or not, is what we're going to talk about tomorrow evening when we're going to talk about how not to go stir crazy. What can you be doing during your days of social distancing and seclusion to make it more spiritual so that it can be a benefit. So this is kind of like an introduction to the topic. What spiritual seclusion is in Islam, in that it does have supporting evidence for it. It does have virtue. It does have many benefits, but it also has some pitfalls. And the Imam, in the next couple of sessions that we have together, is going to talk about 6 benefits and 6 pitfalls of each. I guess, if you will, the benefits of spiritual seclusion, and then the pitfalls of spiritual seclusion, which would be kind of like one is for and one is against. And we're going to look at that together. So kind of in conclusion, one of the great imams, Imam al-Nawawi rahimahullah ta'ala, talks kind of about what the overall agreement of the scholars is. Kind of, this would help us get some, practical understanding of what this kind of thing. He says, in regards to the ruling, if you will, or the scholar's position on uzla or al-ikhtilat, which is either spiritual seclusion or fellowship, he says that it has a lot to do with your social circumstances, essentially. We talked about how the Prophet ﷺ was a man that engaged his community. And he did so and mixed with people in righteous circumstances. He would withdraw from them when they were engaged in sin. He would not sit there and witness and engage with them in sinful ways. But he would withdraw from them during those times. And he would try and create relationships with people that were based on piety and righteousness. Okay? So that's important to keep in mind when we're talking about mukhalata. I mean, when you're going to have fellowship, your fellowship and your relationships, your social relationships shouldn't be based on sin. Let's get together and sin some. No, then there's no doubt. It's better that you go and be by yourself. It's better that you're alone. Don't go out on Friday night if you're going to go party somewhere. If you're going to go somewhere where if you're going to go somewhere where everyone is sinning around you and you're just putting yourself in the middle of it, it's better that you stay home. Seclusion in that moment is better. There's no doubt about it. There's no argument. But if you can go and engage people in a pious way, a righteous way, or at least at the very minimum, just in a permissible way, then bismillah, do that. There could be some benefits for you in that. Especially if you're not going to spend your time alone in worship. If you're not going to spend your time alone in worship and reflection and remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then at the very least you'll be rewarded for trying to connect with brothers, be around sisters, and appropriately, obviously. And so this was kind of the conclusion of many of the scholars based on the life of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. So here it is right here, as I'm wrapping up. I want you to, so I thought a lot about this, and I think about this topic a lot. Spiritual seclusion, what does that mean to me? What does it mean to you? What would it look like? This is where I want to get us to engage a little bit in the comments below. I want you to think for a minute or two. If you're like me, you've probably thought about this a lot more than a minute or two. What would your ideal spiritual seclusion look like? Where would you want to go? How would you want to do it? Because from the manners of this act of righteousness, if you will, is that it can be done anywhere. I mean, some of the scholars, they say, look, as mentioned in the hadith, you go to the gorges of the mountains, like the cave. The Prophet ﷺ, he used to go to the cave. And he would go there and he would meditate, if you will. He would pray. He would leave his city. Why would he leave his city? Why would he leave and seclude himself? He would leave and seclude himself because he was trying to get away from the evil of that community. He was tired of their wicked ways and their sinful nature. And so he would leave the city. He couldn't be around that environment for too long. And so he would go there and he would disengage. So the scholars, they say, look, this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose for his prophet, to go up into a cave. It's elevated. It's far away. It's hard to get to. So it's not like someone can just pop in and check you out and distract you. That's one way. What's another way? Some of the scholars say, look, you go to the shores. You go out to the shores. We like the beaches. We like to go out to the water. You go out there. You go out in the middle of the countryside. You go somewhere where, you're not distracted. And sometimes you stay home. That's mentioned. And sometimes you stay home. Sometimes you stay in your homes. So what would you like to do? I'll tell you mine, just to give you just so you can get like kind of the vibes I'm after here, what kind of fun conversation we can have about this, is All right, either a converted school bus, a schoolie, converted into an RV, or an Airstream, if you know what those are. They're the little travel trailers. And that's me driving around, picking different places, you know, different sceneries, going to the Grand Canyon, going to the mountains, going out to the shore, going out to the countryside, spending some time there, and having time to myself in reflection, in prayer, in remembrance, in reading and studying and learning. And then when it gets tiring, when I get tired and weary, then I go off to the next location. It sounds like a great uzla to me.